The air in Room 3B of the Sterling Medical Center's intensive care unit was a composition played in the key of dread. It was 2 in the morning, a time when the city outside held its breath. But here, life was measured in the relentless, metronomic beeping of machines. The steady beep-beep-beep of the heart monitor was the rhythm section, the soft, percussive hiss-click of the ventilator, the constant, unnerving percussion. It was a sterile symphony, cold and devoid of hope. And then, another sound entered the room, fragile and forbidden. Alara Ellie Vance stood beside the bed, her gloved hand resting lightly on the patient's forearm. Her shift had ended 30 minutes ago, but she couldn't leave. Not yet. She looked at the man engulfed by the white sheets and tangled in a web of IV lines and sensor wires. The world knew him as Julian Ryder, the electric frontman of Orion's Fall, a rock god who could command a stadium of 80,000 souls with a single, raw-throated roar. In here, he was just Patient Ryder, J, coma, M, 30, a collection of labels, a body without a soul. But Ellie didn't believe that. She saw the subtle tension in his brow, the almost imperceptible restlessness in his stillness. She saw a profound loneliness that mirrored the hollow ache in her own chest. Ignoring the knot of fear in her stomacha, fear that had a name, head nurse Brenda Matthews Ellie leaned closer. She took a quiet, steadying breath and began to sing. The willow weeps beside the stone for a love it's never known. Her voice was not the powerhouse belt of a pop star. It was something far more intimate, a clear, silvery thread of sound weaving through the mechanical din. It was a folk lullaby, a melody steeped in Appalachian melancholy, a song her mother had written decades ago on the back of a napkin in a Greyhound bus station, chasing a dream that had ultimately broken her heart. For Ellie, the song was a prayer, a memory, and the only inheritance she had left. The river sighs and rushes on, for a dream that's come and gone. She sang to the still figure, pouring her own exhaustion, her own quiet grief for her mother, and a desperate, defiant flicker of hope into the notes. She sang of loss and endurance, of finding beauty in the broken places. As her voice flowed through the sterile air, something remarkable happened. The frantic, jagged line on the heart monitor seemed to gentle its peaks and valleys. The rhythm slowed, evening out from an anxious 110 beats per minute to a calmer, steadier 95. It was a small change, a whisper in a storm, but to Ellie, it was a conversation. She was just finishing the final verse, her voice tapering into the machine hum, when a shadow fell across the doorway. The air went frigid. "Nurse Vance, what do you think you're doing?" Ellie's heart leaped into her throat. She spun around. Head nurse Brenda Matthews stood there, arms clamped across her chest, her face a mask of pinched, furious disapproval. Her orthopedic shoes had made no sound on the polished linoleum. Brenda's eyes, small and hard, flicked from Ellie to the patient, then back. The look wasn't one of concern for the patient. It was the look of a petty tyrant who had caught a subordinate breaking one of her sacred, unwritten rules. "I was just finishing my rounds," Ellie stammered, her voice now a nervous squeak. "Your rounds ended a half hour ago," Brenda said, her voice like chipping ice. "And they do not, to my knowledge, involve serenades. This is an ICU, not a coffee house. You are disturbing a critically ill patient. You are behaving unprofessionally." "I wasn't." "I don't want to hear it," Brenda snapped, taking a step into the room. Her presence seemed to suck the warmth Ellie's song had created right out of the air. "This is your only warning. I catch you doing this again, and I'll write you up so fast your head will spin. Are we clear?" Ellie could only nod, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and indignation. "Now get out," Brenda ordered, her voice a low hiss. "Go home." As Ellie scurried past, her cheeks burning with humiliation, Brenda stepped up to the bed, her movements brisk and impersonal. She checked the IV drip, made a sharp note on the chart, and completely ignored the man lying in the bed. To Brenda, he was just a problem to be managed. Ellie fled down the hallway, the sterile light making her feel exposed and foolish. But as she pushed through the doors into the humid night air of Chicago, it wasn't Brenda's threat that echoed in her mind. It was the memory of that gentle, calming line on the monitor. It was the feeling, deep in her bones, that for a few precious minutes, someone had been listening. The transition from the chillingly pristine environment of Sterling Medical to the weary, lived-in clutter of her own apartment was always a shock. Ellie's one-bedroom flat in Logan Square was a world away from the hospital's stark modernity. Here, the paint was peeling in a corner of the kitchen, The hardwood floors groaned under her feet, and the air smelled of old books and brewing tea. It was her sanctuary, but it was also a cage built of financial obligations. She dropped her keys into a ceramic bowl, and her eyes immediately fell on the mail piled on her small kitchen counter. On top was a letter from a company called Apex Servicing. The logo was a sharp, aggressive mountain peak, and the words printed in bold red ink were stark and unyielding. Past due notice. A familiar wave of cold dread washed over her, more chilling than Brenda Matthews's glare. Her student loans. The $60,000 anchor chained to her ankle, a constant reminder that her dream of caring for people came with a price she could barely afford to pay. She was a healer, drowning in debt. Ignoring the letter, she opened the fridge. The light flickered on to reveal a half-eaten container of leftover pasta, a carton of orange juice, and a single, sad-looking apple. It was the landscape of a life lived on the run between 12-hour shifts. As she nuked the pasta in the microwave, the machine's hum sounded cheap and grating compared to the sophisticated symphony of the ICU. Later, sitting on the edge of her bed, the city lights painting patterns on her wall, she slid a worn wooden guitar case from beneath the frame. It was heavy, solid. The latches clicked open with a familiar sound, and the scent of old wood and something that smelled faintly of her mother's perfume wafted out. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, was her mother's old acoustic guitar, a 1960s Gibson, its body scarred with nicks and scratches, each one a story Ellie would never fully know. She lifted it out, the wood cool and smooth against her skin. Her fingers, so deft and sure with needles and catheters, felt clumsy on the fretboard. She tried to form the chords to "The Willow Weeps," the song she'd sung to Julian. The sound that came out was muted and clumsy, a ghost of the melody she held in her heart. She didn't have her mother's gift for playing, only for singing. Her gaze drifted to the framed photo on her nightstand. A younger Ellie, maybe 10 years old, with a gap-toothed grin, stood beside a woman with fire in her eyes and a guitar slung over her shoulder. Her mother, Lena Vance, had been a shooting star that burned out too fast. She'd had a voice like honey and whiskey, and a soul full of songs about heartbreak and hope, but the world had never found a place for her. She died of pneumonia at 42, her dreams packed away in this very guitar case. The lullabies were all Ellie had left. Singing them was a ritual, a way to keep that fiery spirit alive in a world that had tried its best to extinguish it. Singing them to the silent man in the ICU, that felt different. It felt like passing a torch, a tiny flame of hope, into a place of profound darkness. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a blocked number. With a sigh, she answered. "Is this Alara Vance?" The voice was a monotone, bored and robotic. "Yes, this is she." "This is Mark from Apex Servicing, calling in regard to your outstanding student loan balance of—" There was a pause as he read the number. 417.38. "Our records indicate your payment is now 45 days overdue. We need to arrange for payment immediately to avoid further penalties and negative reporting to the credit bureaus." "I know, I'm sorry," Ellie said, her voice small. "I had an unexpected expense. My car needed repairs. I can make a partial payment next week, on my payday." "Ma'am, partial payments are not acceptable at this stage," Mark said, his tone unwavering. "The full overdue amount of $854 is required to bring your account current." "I don't have that right now," Ellie said, the words tasting like ash. "I'm a nurse. I work 60 hours a week. I'm doing the best I can." "Your employment status is noted in your file," Mark said, as if commenting on the weather. "However, the terms of your agreement are clear. We will require full payment within 5 business days." The line went dead. Ellie stared at the phone, a fresh wave of rage and helplessness washing over her. This was her life. A thankless, high-stress job where an act of compassion was a punishable offense, and a mountain of debt managed by faceless voices who cared nothing for her circumstances. She placed the guitar gently back in its case, the music silenced once again. The weight of the world felt immense, and she felt very, very small beneath it. The next day, the hospital was buzzing. The usual hushed tension of the ICU had been replaced by a low-level hum of excitement. Julian Ryder was still in a coma, but his celebrity status had breached the walls. A news van was parked out front, a lone vulture waiting for a story. In the nurse's station, the television, usually tuned to a bland 24-hour news channel, was airing a celebrity gossip program. The slick, overly enthusiastic host was doing a special segment on Julian. Tragedy strikes the music world as rock icon Julian Ryder, the voice of a generation, remains in a coma following a devastating motorcycle accident. The host chirped over a montage of explosive concert footage, the screen filled with images of Julian in his element. He was a whirlwind of motion on stage, all lean muscle, black jeans, and sweat-soaked hair, his voice, a captivating howl of poetic angst. He commanded sold-out stadiums, his connection with the crowd visceral and real. Then, the footage cut to an old interview. Julian, younger and with a mischievous glint in his eye, sat beside his bandmates. Leo, the stoic bassist with a thoughtful frown, and Sam, the energetic drummer, a constant blur of motion even while sitting still. Their camaraderie was effortless, a genuine brotherhood. "People think it's about the noise," Julian said in the clip, his voice surprisingly gentle. "But it's not. It's about the silence in between the notes. That's where the feeling is. That's where you find the truth." Ellie watched, mesmerized. That man, the one who understood the power of silence, was now lost in it. The contrast between the vibrant, living force on the screen and the still, pale figure in room 3B was a physical blow. "Of course, the entire world is sending its prayers," the host continued, her tone shifting to one of syrupy concern. "Including his longtime fiancée, model and influencer Serafina Monet." A photo flashed on screen. Julian and a stunningly beautiful woman on a red carpet. She was draped over him, her smile wide and practiced. And his legendary manager, Marcus Thorne, released a statement this morning, assuring fans that, quote, "Jules is a fighter. The final chapter of his story has not yet been written. Orion's fall will fly again." Ellie felt a pang of something she couldn't name. These people, the beautiful fiancé, the powerful manager they were, his world. A world of red carpets, press releases, and carefully managed narratives. A world so utterly alien to her own reality of overdue bills and whispered lullabies. She was a footnote in his chart, a stranger who had dared to sing to him in the dark. She turned away from the screen just as Brenda Matthews rounded the corner. Brenda gave the TV a disdainful look, then pinned Ellie with her gaze. "Vance, you're on the cardiac wing today." Collins called in sick. "They need an extra pair of hands." It wasn't a request. It was an order, and Ellie knew, a punishment. The cardiac wing was notoriously difficult, a high-pressure environment far from the relative quiet of the ICU, far from room 3B. "Yes, head nurse," Ellie said, her voice flat. Brenda gave a tight, satisfied smile. "Good. See that you stick to the protocols over there." As Ellie walked away, the TV host's voice faded behind her. "We'll be right back with more on the vigil being held by fans outside Sterling Medical." The world was praying for Julian Ryder. But Ellie was the only one who had tried to give him a song. And now, she was being sent away. For 3 days, Ellie worked in the relentless churn of the cardiac wing. It was a blur of chest pains, bypass surgeries, and worried families. She barely had time to think, let alone dwell on the injustice of her reassignment. But every night, when she returned to her quiet apartment, the thought of Julian alone in his silent room haunted her. On her 4th day away, she found herself back in the ICU, returning a piece of equipment. The familiar beeping was a strange sort of comfort. She saw one of the ICU nurses, a kind woman named Maria, looking over Julian's chart. "How is he?" Ellie asked, trying to sound casual. Maria sighed, shaking her head. "Not great. His vitals have been erratic, agitated. We've had to increase his sedation twice." A cold knot formed in Ellie's stomach. Agitated. The opposite of the calm she had witnessed when she sang. "Since when?" "Past few days," Maria said, lowering her voice. "Ever since Brenda started cracking down. No noise, no radio, nothing. Just the machines. It feels wrong, you know?" He seems more alone than ever. Ellie's internal conflict, which had been simmering for days, now boiled over. Her career was on the line. Brenda was watching her like a hawk. One more misstep and she'd be out of a job, with no way to pay the bills that were already burying her. But Maria's words, confirming her deepest fears, echoed louder than her own anxieties. He seems more alone than ever. That night, on her shift, she couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility. It was a foolish, irrational thought, but it persisted. She believed in the science of medicine, in dosages and data. But she also believed in something more. She believed in the healing power of human connection, a principle that couldn't be quantified or logged in a chart. Around 1 a.m., the ICU was quiet. Brenda was in a meeting with the night supervisor. It was now or never. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed open the door to room 3B. The air was still and heavy. She walked to his bedside. The man on the bed looked smaller, more fragile than she remembered. His brow was furrowed in a subtle, constant frown. His heart rate, displayed in cold green numbers, was a frantic 115. "I know I'm not supposed to be here," she whispered to the still form. "And I know this is crazy, but I can't leave you in the silence." She took a deep breath, her fear warring with her conviction. Conviction won. She began to sing another one of her mother's lost melodies, this one a simple, hopeful song about a ship finding its way home in a storm. She didn't take her eyes off the monitor. As her voice, soft but sure, filled the space, she watched the number. 115, 112, 108, 105, 196. It settled there, a steady, calm rhythm. The frown lines on his forehead seemed to soften, his whole body relaxing into the mattress. It was real. She wasn't imagining it. This wasn't just a coincidence. She was reaching him. A profound sense of purpose washed over her, silencing the fear. She finished the song, her voice filled with a new strength. She had made her choice. She would not let this man fight his battle alone, no matter what it cost her. This was her act of defiance. The next morning, Dr. Ben Carter, the young, sharp-eyed neurologist on Julian's case, was frowning at a screen full of data. He was a man of science, of evidence-based medicine. He didn't believe in miracles, he believed in patterns. And he had found a very strange one. He had isolated the faint anomalous spikes in Julian Ryder's EEG readouts bursts of higher brain activity that defied medical explanation for a patient this deep in a coma. They were ghosts in the machine. For days, they had vanished completely, and Julian's overall neurological state had stagnated. Then, last night, at 7 a.m., they had reappeared, stronger than before. He cross-referenced the timestamp with the electronic nursing logs. At 5 a.m., Nurse Ella Vance had entered the room to check a fluid drip. She'd stayed for 5 minutes. It was the third time her presence in the room had correlated almost exactly with these unexplained neural events. Dr. Carter leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. It was statistically insignificant. It was anecdotal. It was probably nothing. But it was a pattern, and Dr. Carter, and Ben Carter loved patterns. He made a mental note to keep an eye on Nurse Vance. His thoughts were interrupted by Brenda Matthews marching past his office, her face set like stone. She was carrying a clipboard like a weapon. A few minutes later, she found Ellie stocking a supply closet. "Vance," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "I see on the logs you were in patient Ryder's room again last night." Ellie froze. "I was just checking his drip, head nurse." "For 5 minutes?" Brenda scoffed. "It doesn't take 5 minutes to check a drip. I'm watching you. I told you I was watching you." She brandished the clipboard. "You've been reassigned. Effective immediately. You're floating to the geriatrics ward for the rest of the month." It was a clear and deliberate act of petty cruelty. The geriatrics ward was on the other side of the hospital, a world away from the ICU. It was a sentence of exile. "But," Ellie started. "No buts," Brenda said, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "Go. Now." As Ellie walked the long, sterile corridor toward her new assignment, a sense of cold dread settled over her. She had won a small victory in the night, only to lose the war at dawn. She was being punished for doing something good, and the one person who seemed to benefit from her rebellion was now, once again, completely alone. The rage bait had been set, and Ellie had walked right into the trap. The arrival of the entourage was less a visit and more a hostile takeover. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows slid to a stop at the main entrance of Sterling Medical, ignoring the designated patient drop-off area. The back door opened and Marcus Thorne emerged, already barking into his phone, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the hospital's bland functionality. He radiated an aura of impatient, ruthless efficiency. Following him out was Serafina Monet. She was even more striking in person than on television, a sculpted work of art in designer sunglasses and 4-inch heels that clicked angrily on the pavement. She surveyed the hospital entrance with the look of someone who had just found something vile on the bottom of her shoe. "It smells like sadness and disinfectant," she muttered to Marcus, pulling her silk scarf over her nose. "Manage your optics, Seffi," Marcus hissed without breaking stride, his eyes scanning for paparazzi. "Grieving fiancé, remember?" They bypassed the front desk with a dismissive wave, their arrogance a palpable force field. Inside Julian's room, the mood curdled instantly. Serafina stopped dead at the doorway, her perfectly made-up face contorting in revulsion at the sight of Julian, pale and inanimate, tethered to the machines. "Oh, Jules, my God," she breathed. Her horror seemed genuine for a split second, before her influencer instincts took over. She quickly pulled out her phone, angled it just so, and snapped a discreet selfie of her manicured hand resting near his. Then she stepped back, dropping his hand as if it were contaminated. Marcus, meanwhile, didn't even glance at his client. His focus was on the machinery, the charts, the assets. He immediately cornered the on-duty resident, peppering him with a barrage of questions about prognosis, timelines, and, most importantly, security protocols. He wasn't a friend visiting the sick. He was a CEO inspecting a damaged property. Ellie, on her way to the geriatrics ward, was rerouted by a code blue and found herself passing the ICU just as the scene was unfolding. She saw Serafina shrink away from the bed, and Marcus treat the doctor like an underling. A hot, protective anger flared in her chest. These were the people who were supposed to love him? Her new assignment was a form of purgatory. The geriatrics ward was understaffed and overwhelming, a place of slow decay and quiet desperation, but her mind was never far from room 3B. Days later, her rotation finally brought her back to the ICU floor to retrieve a specific medication. It was then that she ran into them. She entered Julian's room to log the medication retrieval and found Marcus and Serafina there. The air was thick with tension. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. He had positioned himself between her and the bed, a human barrier. "I'm Alara Vance," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm one of the nurses." "One of the nurses," he repeated slowly, his eyes sweeping over her plain blue scrubs with unconcealed disdain. "And what is his status? Has there been any change? Who has been cleared for access to this room?" "You'd have to speak with Dr. Carter about his status," Ellie replied calmly, refusing to be intimidated. "I was just here for a medication." "See that you get it and go," Marcus ordered. Serafina, who had been scrolling through her phone, looked up, her gaze dismissive. "Can we hire a private nurse?" she whispered loudly to Marcus, as if Ellie wasn't even there. "One that doesn't look so dreary." The insult, so casual and cruel, struck Ellie like a physical slap. She grabbed the medication, signed the log, and walked out, her back ramrod straight, her cheeks burning. The arrogance, the sheer callousness of them, was breathtaking. They weren't protecting Julian, they were protecting their brand. Marcus Thorne was a man who didn't leave things to chance. He saw Ellie not as a caregiver, but as a loose variable, an unpredictable element in a carefully controlled equation. He saw the flicker of defiance in her eyes and decided to eliminate the threat. The next day, he requested a formal meeting with head nurse Brenda Matthews. He sat in her small, tidy office, exuding an air of power that had Brenda sitting up straighter, her expression a mixture of deference and excitement. "Brenda," he began, using her first name with a familiarity that was both flattering and commanding. "I'm concerned about the professionalism of some of the staff." Brenda leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Oh?" "A particular nurse," Marcus continued, his tone grave. "Vance, I believe her name is. I've been made aware that she has developed something of an inappropriate fixation on Julian, spending unauthorized time in his room. It's the kind of celebrity-obsessed behavior that could become a serious liability for this hospital, for us." He knew exactly which buttons to push. Liability, unprofessionalism. Brenda, who already despised Ellie's compassionate approach, eagerly seized the narrative Marcus offered. It validated her every petty grievance. "I assure you, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice filled with grim satisfaction. "I have had my eye on Nurse Vance. Her conduct has been a concern of mine for some time. This will be dealt with. Sterling Medical has a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of behavior." The unholy alliance was forged. Marcus had his weapon, and Brenda had her justification. For Ellie, the walls were closing in. The summons came via a sterile email. Meeting required. Professional conduct review. Ellie found herself seated at a long, polished table in a soulless conference room. Across from her sat Mr. Davenport, the hospital administrator, a man with a tailored suit and the cold, dead eyes of a shark. Brenda was beside him, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Davenport didn't make eye contact. He read from a file in a flat monotone. Nurse Vance, a formal complaint has been filed by the patient's legal representative regarding unprofessional conduct and multiple boundary violations. The complaint alleges a pattern of obsessive behavior, Brenda added, piling on. They never mentioned the singing. The accusation was vague, insidious, and nearly impossible to defend against. Ellie's hands were trembling under the table. "That's not true," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I was just trying to provide compassionate care. I believe in treating the whole patient, his mind and his spirit, not just his body." "Your personal beliefs are irrelevant, Nurse Vance." Davenport cut her off, finally looking at her. His gaze was utterly devoid of empathy. "What is relevant are hospital policy and the wishes of the patient's family and representatives. Their complaint is now part of your permanent record. This is your final written warning." He slid a piece of paper across the table. "You are hereby forbidden from entering patient Ryder's room unless accompanied by a senior nurse. One more misstep, real or perceived, and your employment with Sterling Medical will be terminated. Am I understood?" Ellie looked from his cold face to Brenda's smug one. She was being silenced, her kindness twisted into a pathology. The system wasn't just broken, it was actively hostile to the very compassion it was supposed to represent. "Yes," she whispered, the word tasting like defeat. "Understood." A few days later, a different kind of energy arrived at the ICU. Julian's bandmates, Leo and Sam, walked in looking lost and utterly out of place. Leo, the bassist, was tall and quiet, his face etched with a deep, weary concern. Sam, the drummer, seemed to vibrate with a nervous energy, his eyes red-rimmed and darting around as if the answers to this nightmare might be hiding in a corner. Unlike Marcus and Serafina, they moved with a heavy humility. They brought a large box of expensive coffee and donuts for the nurse's station. "For putting up with all this?" Sam mumbled, gesturing vaguely at the media presence outside. They sat by Julian's bed for hours. They didn't look at their phones. They talked to him, their voices low and thick with emotion. They told him stories from their last tour, ribbed him about a terrible song he'd once tried to write, and pleaded with him to come back to them. Their grief was raw and real. Ellie saw them in the hallway during her break. Marcus was with them, his hand on Sam's shoulder in a gesture that looked more like restraint than comfort. "This is one of the nurses, Ellie," Marcus said, his introduction a clear dismissal. He gave her a sharp, warning glare that said, "Say nothing." But Leo and Sam looked at her with sincere, desperate eyes. "Thank you," Leo said, his voice raspy. For taking care of him. We really appreciate it." "He's a fighter," Sam added, trying for a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "He'll be okay, right?" Ellie looked at their worried faces, and her heart broke for them. They were good people, trapped in the orbit of a man like Marcus. She wanted to tell them about the music, about the change in the vitals, about the hope she felt. But Marcus's cold stare was a physical barrier. She could only nod. "We're all doing our best for him," she said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. That night, Ellie sat in her apartment, the formal warning letter from Davenport lying on her coffee table like a death sentence. She felt utterly, completely beaten. She had poured her heart into her work, a job that was now threatening to discard her for the crime of caring too much. The weight of her debt, the loneliness of her life, and the injustice of the situation coalesced into a suffocating blanket of despair. She picked up her phone and called her father, a retired factory worker in Ohio. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it broke as she explained what had happened. "They make you feel like caring is a crime, Dad," she choked out, tears finally streaming down her face. "They twist everything." "I'm so sorry, Ellie Bean," he said, his voice rough with concern. Maybe it's time to come home for a bit. This Chicago, it sounds like it's eating you alive." His words, meant to be comforting, only deepened her sense of failure. She hung up, a hollow feeling echoing inside her. She walked to her closet, pulled out her mother's guitar case, and shoved it deep into the back, behind a stack of old winter coats. The music, and the hope it represented, felt like a foolish, childish dream. Maybe it was time to give up. Maybe it was time to just be a good, quiet, invisible nurse. Do her job, pay her bills, and forget she ever dared to believe she could make a difference. She was packing her personal items from her locker the next evening, her resignation letter written and folded in her pocket, when she nearly collided with Dr. Carter in the hallway. "Whoa, sorry," he said, steadying her. "Leaving early, Vance?" "Something like that," she mumbled, not meeting his eyes. He hesitated, then lowered his voice, his expression serious. "I'm not supposed to say this, and you did not hear it from me, but I've been analyzing patient Ryder's neurological data for weeks." Ellie looked up, her heart giving a painful lurch. There were anomalous brain activities faint, but present that correlated almost perfectly with the times you were logged as being in his room. Since you've been reassigned, they've vanished. His condition hasn't just plateaued, the underlying metrics show a slight decline. He paused, his gaze intense. "I don't know what you were doing in there, but the data suggests it was helping." He gave her a single, meaningful nod, then turned and walked away, leaving Ellie standing frozen in the middle of the hallway. The data suggests it was helping. It wasn't just her imagination. It wasn't just a flight of fancy. It was real. A flicker of validation, of scientific proof, ignited a fire in her soul. She looked down at the resignation letter in her pocket. Quitting now wouldn't just be letting herself down. It would be a betrayal of Julian, of her own convictions, of the last shred of her mother's legacy. It would be letting Brenda and Marcus and Davenport win. In a single, decisive moment, she reached into her pocket, pulled out the letter, and ripped it into tiny pieces, letting them fall to the floor like snow. She was not running. She was not quitting. She was a nurse, and her patient needed her. With a newfound purpose hardening her expression, she turned and walked purposefully toward the ICU. She was risking everything, but for the first time in a long time, she felt completely, thrillingly alive. The ICU at 3:00 a.m. was a ghost town, a landscape of sleeping patients and droning machines. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady rhythm of the monitors. Every shadow seemed to hold the specter of Brenda Matthews. This was it. There was no going back. She slipped into room 3B, the door clicking softly shut behind her. The room felt colder than before, the silence heavier. Julian looked the same, yet different. There was a tension in his stillness now, a visible struggle in the faint crease between his brows. His heart rate was elevated again, a testament to the silent battle being waged within him. "Okay, Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "This is probably the last time. They're going to fire me for this. But I can't leave you like this. I just can't." She took a deep breath, pushing aside her fear. This time, she wouldn't sing a song of weeping willows or lost ships. She would sing the song that was most deeply hers, the one her mother had sung to her in the final, fading days of her life. It wasn't a lullaby of sleep, but a hymn of endurance. A song about finding light in the deepest, most absolute darkness. She closed her eyes and let the melody pour out of her. She sang with everything she had, her frustration at the world's injustice, her grief for her lost mother, her defiance against the cold bureaucracy that sought to crush the human spirit, and her one, desperate, shining sliver of hope for the man in the bed. Her voice soared, pure and powerful, a beacon in the sterile darkness. The door burst open with a violent crash. I knew it. Brenda Matthews stood there, her face incandescent with triumphant rage. Behind her, 2 burly hospital security guards flanked a smug, victorious-looking Marcus Thorne. He had a phone in his hand, likely having been alerted by his ally. "Security, remove her!" Brenda shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Ellie. "She's trespassing! She's terminated! I want her out of this hospital now!" The guards moved forward, their expressions grim. Marcus crossed his arms, a cruel smile playing on his lips. This was the end. Ellie closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a hot path down her cheek, bracing for the humiliation of being physically dragged away. "Get away from her." The voice was a rasp, a dry, cracked whisper, like stones grinding together. It was barely audible, but it sliced through the tension in the room like a scalpel. Everyone froze. The guards stopped in their tracks. Brenda's mouth fell open. Marcus's smug expression vanished, replaced by sheer, slack-jawed shock. Ellie's eyes snapped open. Julian Ryder's eyes were open. They were just slits, clouded and unfocused, but they were undeniably open. He was looking at her. He swallowed, a painful, difficult motion. He tried again, his voice a little stronger, a raw, desperate whisper. Don't. Stop. The world tilted on its axis. Chaos erupted. Brenda stammered, pointing, speechless. Marcus was ghost white. The security guards looked at each other, utterly lost. Ellie, her own shock momentarily forgotten, switched instantly into nurse mode. She rushed to his side, her hands checking his pulse, her voice calm and professional. Julian, can you hear me? Can you squeeze my hand? His fingers twitched, then weakly closed around hers. At that moment, Dr. Carter, alerted by the commotion, sprinted into the room, followed by other nurses. The scene was one of controlled pandemonium. Brenda and Marcus were shunted to the side, suddenly irrelevant. What happened? Dr. Carter demanded, shining a penlight into Julian's eyes. Julian blinked against the light, his gaze still fixed on Ellie. When Dr. Carter asked him if he remembered anything, his voice was a faint, ragged whisper, but his words were clear. The music, he breathed. There was an angel singing. He shifted his gaze, his eyes finding the stunned faces of Brenda and Marcus by the door. A flicker of anger crossed his features. They tried to make her stop. The accusation hung in the air, damning and irrefutable. In that instant, the power dynamic in the room inverted completely. Ellie was no longer the rogue nurse. She was the catalyst of a miracle. Brenda was no longer the enforcer of rules. She was the woman who had tried to silence an angel. Marcus was no longer the powerful manager. He was the villain of the story, exposed in the light. Dr. Carter looked from his miraculous patient to Ellie, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe and respect. The data had been right. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Julian's recovery was astonishing, miraculous. Once the dam had broken, the progress was swift. Within a day, he was breathing on his own. Within 3, he was speaking in full, albeit weak, sentences. The hospital was in an uproar, the media outside in a frenzy. The purge was swift and merciless. Serafina was the first to go. She swept into the room a day after he woke, her act of the grieving fiancé back in full force. Jules! Oh, baby, I was so worried. I never left your side. She leaned in to kiss him, but he turned his head, his eyes now clear and unnervingly perceptive. I was in the dark, Sephi, but I wasn't deaf, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the cold weight of iron. I heard you, on the phone with your agent, complaining about the smell, asking if my credit cards were still active, wondering how long you had to play this part before you could access the accounts. Serafina froze, the color draining from her face. She looked like a cornered animal. Get out, Julian said. It wasn't a shout, it was a calm, final judgment. And tell your lawyer not to call mine. She fled, her heels clicking a panicked retreat down the hallway, leaving a trail of humiliation in her wake. Marcus was next. He tried to reclaim control, striding into the room with a tablet, talking about press releases and narrative shaping. We can spin this, Jules. A story of fighting back, with the full support of Sterling Medical's excellent care team. Julian, propped up on his pillows and flanked by a tearfully joyful Leo and Sam, held up a hand to silence him. I also heard you, Marcus, he said, his voice gaining strength. I heard you talking to the label on speakerphone. What was it you called her? He glanced at Ellie, who was quietly changing his IV bag. A hick nurse. A liability you were going to pay off and get rid of once I was stable. Marcus Thorne, the man who controlled narratives for a living, had lost control of his own. His professional mask crumbled, revealing the ugly, craven man beneath. You're fired, Marcus, Julian said, his voice flat and final. Clean out your office. You're done. The powerful manager, who had terrorized Ellie and manipulated the hospital, simply stood there, speechless and broken, before turning and walking away, a ghost in $1,000 suit. In the quiet moments that followed, when the doctors and the band had left them alone, Julian would ask Ellie to tell him about the songs. For the first time, she opened up completely. She told him about her mother, the failed folk singer with a soul full of music. She told him about her own stage fright, her clumsy fingers on the guitar, and how the lullabies were the only part of her mother's dream she felt worthy of carrying. Singing to you, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. It felt like I was trying to heal us both. Julian listened, his gaze never leaving her face. He, the man who lived his life in the spotlight, understood the terror and vulnerability of sharing one's soul through music. In the coma, he said, his own voice thick with emotion. It was just dark. A silent, endless ocean. Your voice? It was the only lighthouse. The only thing that felt real. It gave me a reason to swim back. A bond formed between them in that quiet room, forged in shared vulnerability and the sacred power of a song. It wasn't the stuff of tabloid headlines. It was something deeper, truer. Meanwhile, the hospital administration was in full damage control mode. Mr. Davenport appeared on a national news channel, his face a mask of corporate sincerity. At Sterling Medical, we believe in a holistic approach to healing, he said, his voice smooth as silk. We encourage our staff to connect with patients on a deep, human level. Nurse Vance's initiative is a wonderful example of the Sterling way. Ellie watched the interview on the lounge TV and let out a short, bitter laugh. A week ago, the Sterling way had been threatening to ruin her life. A quiet memo later announced that head nurse Brenda Matthews had been promoted to a purely administrative, non-patient-facing role at a suburban clinica, clear, humiliating exile designed to make the problem disappear. The day Julian was discharged, the room was full of light and laughter. Leo and Sam were helping him into a fresh set of clothes, arguing over which band t-shirt was softest. Ellie was doing a final check of his vitals, her heart light for the first time in months. Julian waited until she was done. Then he turned to her, his expression serious. Ellie, he said, his voice clear and strong. My band is a family. You saved me, and you saved our family. But it's more than that. He looked at Leo and Sam, who were grinning knowingly. In that darkness, I didn't just hear your kindness. I heard your talent. I heard your mother's songs. That music doesn't belong in a hospital. It belongs on a stage. Ellie stared at him, her mind unable to process his words. We're postponing the big stadium tour, he continued, his eyes shining. We're going to do a smaller, more intimate acoustic run first. Get back to the real music. And we want you to be our opening act. Not as a gimmick, Ellie. Not as a story. As an artist. We want to book you for a world tour. He leaned forward, his smile reaching his eyes for the first time. What do you say? Ready to trade in your scrubs for a microphone? Ellie Vance, the overlooked nurse who sang forbidden lullabies, stood stunned into silence. The world she had fought so hard just to survive in had suddenly cracked open, revealing a future she had never, in her wildest dreams, dared to imagine. The weeks that followed were a surreal montage, a life lived in fast forward. The story exploded across the media landscape. Tabloid headlines screamed, Coma Rocker's Nurse, Angel Gets Record Deal, and The Lullaby That Woke the Leon. The fallout for their tormentors was swift and brutal. Serafina appeared on a trashy reality show, attempting to portray herself as the heartbroken victim, but her bitter, vindictive performance backfired, and she became a running joke on social media. Marcus Thorne's threatened lawsuit evaporated when an audio clip surreptitiously recorded by Sam on his phone of Marcus calling Ellie a gold-digging hick and plotting to manage her out of the picture was leaked to a popular music blog. His career was over before he could even file the paperwork. Ellie walked into Mr. Davenport's office, handed him her resignation, and walked out without a word, leaving him stammering in her wake. Her last act at Sterling Medical was to leave a thank you note and a box of expensive chocolates at the nurses' station for Maria and the other nurses who had shown her kindness. Her new life began in a cavernous, brick-walled rehearsal studio in downtown Chicago. The initial days were terrifying. Surrounded by the professional musicianship of Orion's Fall, she was overwhelmed by a crushing wave of imposter syndrome. She was a nurse who sang to herself, not a musician. Her hands trembled when she held her mother's guitar. Her voice wavered under the scrutiny of the sound engineer. But Julian, Leo, and Sam formed a protective circle around her. They were patient, encouraging, and fiercely protective. Leo, the quiet bassist, would wordlessly adjust her microphone stand to the perfect height. Sam, the energetic drummer, was her biggest cheerleader, whooping with delight every time she nailed a difficult passage. And Julian was her anchor. He never pushed, never criticized. He'd sit with her for hours, helping her arrange her mother's songs, finding the perfect harmonies. Just sing it like you did in the room, he'd say gently. Sing it like no one is listening but me. Slowly, her confidence began to grow. She co-wrote a new song with Julian, a bright, hopeful melody about second chances, their voices blending together as if they were always meant to. She was no longer just singing her mother's songs. She was building on her legacy, creating something new. The first show was at the historic Chicago Theater, a sold-out homecoming. Backstage, the roar of the crowd was a terrifying, living entity. Ellie stood in the wings, her hands cold and clammy, her stomach churning. She was wearing a simple black dress, her mother's guitar strapped over her shoulder. She felt like a fraud. "I can't do this," she whispered to Julian, her voice tight with panic. "I'm a nurse. I belong in an ICU, not out there." Julian took her hand, his own warm and steady. He looked into her eyes, his gaze cutting through her fear. "You belong wherever your voice is," he said softly. "You sang for an audience of one in the middle of the night with everything to lose. This is the easy part. Just do the same thing, but with better lighting." He squeezed her hand. "Sing for me." The stage manager gave her the cue. Her legs felt like lead as she walked out into the blinding white light. A sea of thousands of faces stared back at her. For a terrifying second, she panicked, her throat closing up. Then she saw him, watching from the wings, his face full of unwavering belief in her. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and pictured room 3B. She wasn't on a stage. She was beside a bed. She wasn't singing for thousands. She was singing for one. She began to play the opening chords of The Willow Weeps. A hush fell over the entire theater. The only sound was the pure, clear thread of her voice and the gentle strum of the old Gibson. She sang the song of loneliness and love, and the vast, ornate theater transformed into an intimate, sacred space. When the last note faded, there was a beat of profound silence, and then the room erupted. The applause was a tidal wave of sound, of acceptance, of love. Ellie opened her eyes, tears blurring her vision, and smiled. Later that night, in the quiet of the green room, the applause still ringing in her ears, Julian found her. "I never properly thanked you," he said, his voice soft. She laughed, the sound bubbling up from a place of pure joy. "You gave me a world tour. I think we're even." "No," he said, stepping closer. His expression was serious, vulnerable. "Thank you for not giving up on me when everyone else, including myself, already had." He gently reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers warm against her skin. "Thank you for showing me what music is supposed to be about." He leaned in, and the kiss they shared wasn't a dramatic rock star kiss for the cameras. It was quiet, tender, and certain. It was a kiss of gratitude, of partnership, of two souls who had found their way out of the darkness, together. It was the beginning. 1 year later, a glossy magazine sat on a coffee table in a sun-drenched Los Angeles home. It was the cover of Rolling Stone. On it, Ellie and Julian stood side by side, a guitar in each of their hands, laughing. The headline read, "The Sound of a Second Chance: How Orion's Fall and Ella Vance Found Harmony in the Silence."